Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to get into some economics?
Always, though today we're doing things a little differently.
Yeah, you won't find us sifting through any textbook today. We're going
Yeah.
behind the scenes of Ireland's Leaving Certificate Economics exam.
Using the 2021 Higher Level Economics Marking Scheme, to be precise.
Sounds dry, but trust me, it's packed with a real-world example.
Exactly. Recent events, key principles, all wrapped up in one.
It's a glimpse into what's actually important in economics right now in Ireland.
And we're here to connect the dots, break it down, and make it all a bit more engaging.
Sounds good. So let's dive into Section A of the marking scheme. What's first?
Basic economic concepts. Things like trade balances, the difference between a country's exports and imports.
Right.
Like in 2019, Ireland's trade balance, well, it was a surplus of 237 million. We exported way more than we imported.
So that's got to be a good thing, right? More money flowing into the Irish economy?
It can be, but it's not always that straightforward.
Oh, how so?
Well, a trade surplus shows a strong export sector, which can mean economic growth. But if the demand at home is higher than what we're producing, it can actually drive prices up for everyone.
Ah, so it's not all sunshine and roses? Got to look at the whole picture.
Exactly.
The marking scheme also talks about market failures. They use cigarettes as an example to explain what are called demerit goods.
Demerit goods, yeah. Those are things we tend to, overconsume. We don't always see the long-term harm they cause.
Like cigarettes and alcohol. Maybe even too much sugar.
All of those, yep. And the marking scheme points out that buying these things is a market failure.
A market failure, why is that?
Because the price we pay for them doesn't show the real cost to society. Think about cigarettes, the price at the shop. It doesn't cover the healthcare costs of smoking-related illnesses or the impact of secondhand smoke on others.
So when the government puts higher taxes on cigarettes, they're trying to make the price reflect that hidden cost
Yeah.
to get people to buy less.
Exactly. It's an attempt to fix that market failure and reduce the harm.
Makes sense.
Now, let's shift gears to the Central Bank of Ireland. The marking scheme uses a real-world example to illustrate this. The KBC tracker mortgage scandal.
Oh yeah, that was a big one. Lots of people affected by that. What exactly happened?
Basically, KBC and a few other banks, they denied some customers tracker mortgages. Those are tied to lower interest rates, the ones set by the ECB. It ended up costing those people a lot of money.
So it shows why we need a strong central bank, right? To make sure banks are playing fair.
Absolutely. The central bank's job is to regulate the entire financial system, keep things stable, protect consumers.
It's a reminder that even though we don't always think about it, the central bank plays a huge part in our financial lives every day.
It really does. Now let's look at how we measure a country's well-being. The marking scheme compares two key indicators: the Human Development Index, or HDI, and something most people are more familiar with, the Gross Domestic Product, or GDP.
So it's not just about how much money a country makes, but things like how long people live and how good their education is.
That's the idea. The HDI looks at the bigger picture, beyond just economic growth. And what's interesting is the marking scheme shows that some countries with high GDP might actually have lower HDI rankings.
So a country can be really wealthy, but still not provide a good quality of life for its people.
Exactly. Economic growth doesn't automatically mean everyone benefits. Things like healthcare, education, making sure income is distributed fairly, those policies can really boost a country's HDI ranking.
Makes you think. Policymakers need to look at all these things, not just the economics, when they're making decisions that affect people's lives.
Agreed. Now let's dive into government finances. The marking scheme looks at Ireland's gross debt per person from 2007 to 2019.
That period includes the global financial crisis, right?
Yeah.
I'm guessing the numbers aren't pretty.
Yeah, you're right. The data shows a steep climb in debt, especially between 2007 and 2013. The government had to bail out banks, deal with the fallout of the crisis, all of that.
So what does it mean when a country has a large national debt? What are the consequences?
Well, one big issue is that the government has to use a chunk of its money just to pay interest on that debt. It's called servicing the debt. And that means less money for other important things like infrastructure, social programs, you name it.
It's another one of those trade-offs, isn't it? Like we talked about with the trade surplus.
Exactly. Governments have to balance competing priorities, make tough choices about where the money goes. And speaking of choices, the marking scheme also looks at how individuals make economic decisions. They use the example of a consumer named John to explain the equimarginal principle.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the equimarginal principle all about?
It's the idea that we as consumers try to spend our money in a way that maximizes our satisfaction. Think about it. If you've got a certain amount to spend on entertainment each month, you're going to choose how to spend it based on what you enjoy most, right?
So if I'm a movie buff, I'm probably going to spend more on cinema tickets than, say, concert tickets.
Exactly. The equal marginal principle says you'll adjust your spending until each euro you spend on entertainment gives you roughly the same level of satisfaction, taking into account what you like and how much each activity costs.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot where every euro spent brings maximum joy.
You got it. Now, let's zoom out from individuals and look at different market structures. The marking scheme uses examples from the Irish market to illustrate this.
Okay, I'm curious, what kind of examples?
Well, they use the banking sector as an example of an oligopoly. That's a market dominated by a few big players. Then you've got Irish Water, our national water utility, as an example of a monopoly. Only one supplier there.
So those are quite different. What else?
They also use takeaway food outlets to show monopolistic competition. That's where you have lots of firms offering similar but not identical products.
Ah, so all those different takeaway options, Italian, Indian, Chinese, and so on, they're all competing, but each trying to offer something unique.
Exactly. And that competition. It can be good for us as consumers. It often means lower prices and more choices.
I'm starting to see how all these economic concepts are connected to things we experience every day.
Right. Economics is all around us. Okay, to wrap up this section of the marking scheme, let's look at interest rates set by the European Central Bank. There's a graph showing the trend from 2008 to 2020. What jumps out at you?
Well, the first thing I see is a big drop in rates right after the 2008 financial crisis. They went from almost 4% down to almost zero.
Right. The ECB was trying to give the economy a boost by making it cheaper for businesses to borrow and invest. The idea was that this would get things moving again, help create jobs.
And those rates stayed low for years,
Yeah,
even through the COVID-19 pandemic.
they did. The ECB, like other central banks globally, they use low interest rates to try to support their economies during those crises. Of course, keeping rates that low for a long time can have some downsides too, like maybe fueling asset bubbles. It's a tricky balancing act.
Wow, we've already covered so much. Trade balances, market failures, the central bank, and even how people make decisions about spending their money. It's really interesting how interconnected it all is.
It is, but we're just getting started. Section B of the marking scheme dives into even more hot topics like globalization, those corporation tax policies, and even the economics of that PlayStation 5 shortage.
Can't wait to get into it. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're digging deeper into the Leaving Certificate Economics exam. Section B, to be exact, and let me tell you, it gets pretty interesting.
It does. Section B really tackles some big issues, things that impact all of us. Globalization, taxes, you name it.
Sounds intense. Where should we start?
Well, let's look at the global aircraft market. The marking scheme uses this as a way to explain market concentration. It even throws in this thing called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI.
HHI. That's a mouthful. What is it exactly? What does it measure?
Basically, it helps us understand how competitive a certain market is.
Sure.
You look at all the companies in that industry, how much market share each one has. The higher the HHI, the more concentrated the market, meaning fewer companies hold all the power.
So a high HHI is bad news for competition.
Generally, yes. And according to the marking scheme, the global aircraft market in 2018, it had an HHI of 4,262. That's pretty high.
Wow, okay. But what does that mean for the average person, someone who just wants to book a flight?
Well, it means you probably don't have a lot of airlines to choose from, especially for those long flights. Less competition often means higher ticket prices, fewer flights available, and sometimes airlines just don't even bother with certain routes.
So this concentration thing, it doesn't just affect the big airplane manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus. It affects us, the passengers, too.
Absolutely. And the marking scheme gets into the strategies these big companies use. It says sometimes starting a price war isn't the best move.
Really? I thought lower prices were good for consumers.
You'd think so, right?
Mm.
But when you have just a few powerful players in a market, a price war can actually hurt everyone in the long run. If they keep cutting prices to beat each other, their profits take a hit, and then they don't have the money to invest in things like new planes, better service.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Being competitive, but also making sure the business can survive. What about those smaller aircraft manufacturers, though? How do they manage to stay afloat in a market like that?
Good question. The marking scheme addresses that too. Those smaller companies like Embraer and Bombardier, they often focus on specific areas of the market, niche markets. like regional jets or those specialized cargo planes. That way they can compete more effectively.
So it's like finding their own space where they can offer something unique, something valuable.
Exactly. Now let's talk about something that's been shaping our world in a huge way, globalization.
Globalization, yeah. People seem to either love it or hate it.
Yeah.
But it's probably more complicated than that, right?
It is. The marking scheme points out that globalization has done a lot of good. More trade, economic growth, millions of people lifted out of poverty, it's connected people and ideas across borders.
Those all sound positive. But what about the downsides? I know people have concerns about globalization too.
There are downsides, for sure. Globalization has contributed to job losses in some industries, especially manufacturing, because companies move production to countries where labor is cheaper. And some argue that it's led to more inequality both within and between countries.
It's a mixed bag then, winners and losers.
It is, and that's why it's so important to talk about how we manage the downsides of globalization while still taking advantage of the good things it brings.
It's all about finding that balance again, right?
Yeah. Okay, ready to tackle another controversial topic?
Hit me with it.
Ireland's corporation tax rate. It's been a hot topic both here and internationally.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about that. Can you give me a quick recap?
Sure. So Ireland has a really low corporation tax rate, 12.5%. It's been a key part of our strategy to attract foreign direct investment, or FDI.
So the idea is lower taxes mean more multinational companies will set up shop here. More jobs, more investment.
Exactly. And it's worked pretty well, actually. Ireland's become a hub for all kinds of companies. Tech, pharmaceuticals, finance, the list goes on. It's given our economy a major boost.
But there's been pushback. Right, people saying it's not fair.
There has. Some argue that it lets big companies shift their profits to countries with low taxes, which means other governments lose out on revenue they need.
And there's been a lot of talk about this global minimum corporate tax rate. What would that mean for Ireland?
It's a big question, and one Ireland is grappling with right now. If that global minimum tax happens, it could make Ireland less attractive for these multinational companies.
And that could have a big impact on our economy. So it's complicated, no easy answers.
It is. Now, remember that PlayStation 5 shortage we talked about? Those things were impossible to find when they first came out.
Oh, I remember. I spent weeks trying to get one online before they sold out everywhere. What was going on there?
That was a classic example of excess demand. Way more people wanted the PS5 than there were PS5s available. Part of the problem was supply chain disruptions because of the pandemic.
So COVID made things even worse. But what about those crazy prices I saw online? People were reselling them for way more than they were worth.
That's the secondary market at work. People who managed to get a PS5 saw an opportunity. They knew it was scarce, so they jacked up the price.
Basic economics, right?
Yeah.
Supply and demand. The marking scheme also talks about Black Friday deals, how they can be misleading. It uses this to explain something called information asymmetry.
Oh yeah, those deals that seem too good to be true. Sometimes they are. Information asymmetry happens when one side in a transaction knows more than the other. In this case, the retailer knows the real cost and quality of the product, but the customer doesn't.
So you might see this huge discount and think you're getting a great deal, but maybe the product isn't that great, or maybe the sale price is just the regular price.
That's it. It means consumers might make decisions that aren't really in their best interest. The marking scheme even talks about possible solutions, like stricter rules around advertising and pricing.
So the government's stepping in to protect consumers from being tricked. It's interesting how these economic ideas show up in everyday situations.
It is. Now let's look at another example. Apple AirPods. Remember when they dropped the price a while back?
Vaguely. I mostly just remember everyone suddenly had them.
That's what's interesting about it. The marking scheme uses this example to talk about price elasticity of demand.
Okay, remind me, what's price elasticity again?
It's a way to measure how much the demand for a product changes when the price changes. With those AirPods, when they lowered the price, a lot more people got them. That means people were really sensitive to the price change.
So I bet Apple sold a ton of AirPods after they lowered the price.
They did. It shows how useful understanding price elasticity can be for businesses. If they know how much people's buying habits will change based on the price, they can make smarter decisions about their pricing.
It makes sense. So it's not just about setting the highest price, but finding that sweet spot where you sell the most and make the most money.
Exactly. It's all about balance. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about inflation. It's been a big topic lately.
I know. Prices are going up everywhere. It's worrying a lot of people.
It is. The marking scheme has this graph comparing Ireland's inflation rate to the UK and the euro area from 2014 to 2019. And to get this, Ireland consistently had the lowest inflation rate during that time.
So prices here were rising more slowly than in other countries. That sounds like a good thing.
It can be. It means people's purchasing power stays pretty stable, but if inflation is consistently low, it could also mean that demand in the economy is weak.
So it's good and bad.
Yeah, sort of. It's something policymakers have to keep a close eye on, and they have different ways to try to manage inflation, like changing interest rates or using what are called fiscal policies.
This is getting complicated.
It is. There are so many things to consider when you're trying to manage an economy. Which brings us to national competitiveness. That's super important for a small, open economy like Ireland's.
How does a country become more competitive, though?
Well, one big idea is comparative advantage. Basically, countries should focus on what they're good at. Produce things they can make more efficiently or more cheaply than other countries.
Play to your strengths, basically.
Right. And the marking scheme uses a really specific example for Ireland, the National Broadband Plan. It might seem like just a technology thing, but having access to fast internet is actually crucial for a country's economy to be competitive.
Oh, so?
Think about it. It lets businesses work more efficiently, people can work from home more easily, and it makes the country more attractive for foreign investment.
So investing in good infrastructure is actually investing in the future of the economy.
It is, and it's a great example of how something that might seem totally unrelated can actually impact how a country performs in the global economy.
This whole deep dive into the Leaving Cert economics exam has been so interesting. Globalization, taxes, PlayStation 5s. It's amazing how economics is woven into so many parts of our lives.
It is, and we're not done yet. Up next, we'll be exploring even more fascinating topics. The multiplier effect, how the aviation sector affects employment, even the debate around minimum wage increases.
I'm ready for it. Back again for the deep dive. We're wrapping up our journey through the Leaving Certificate economics exam. And trust me, the insights just keep coming.
Yeah, we've unpacked a lot of complex stuff already, but Section B of this marking scheme, it goes even deeper, gives us more to think about in terms of how these things actually work in the real world.
I'm ready for more. What's on the agenda today?
Let's circle back to GDP and GNI. Remember, GDP, that's the total value of everything produced within a country's borders. But GNI focuses on the income earned by residents, regardless of where it comes from.
Right, and we talked about how GNI might actually be a better way to look at Ireland's economy because of all the multinational companies here.
The marking scheme digs into that a bit more because, yeah, those companies, they contribute to GDP by what they produce here, but a lot of their profits, they end up flowing back to their home countries.
So GDP might make it look like there's more income staying in Ireland than there actually is.
Yeah, it can give a bit of a skewed picture. GNI is a bit more accurate because it takes those profit outflows into account. It's a small difference, but an important one, especially for an economy like Ireland's.
And that also ties into how we measure recessions, right?
It does. The marking scheme defines a recession as 2 quarters in a row of negative economic growth, and it uses GNI to measure that.
Okay.
There's this graph in the marking scheme showing GNI trends for Ireland and the U.S. from 2000 to 2011. And you can see very clearly both countries went through a recession during the global financial crisis back in 2008-2009.
That drop in GNI, it really shows how much that crisis affected everyone all around the world.
It does, and it shows why understanding these economic indicators is so important. It's not just about numbers, it's about what those numbers mean for people, for the world.
Absolutely. Okay. Ready to tackle a concept that often makes people's eyes glaze over?
Hit me.
The multiplier effect.
Ah, yes, the multiplier effect. It sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty cool. Basically, it explains how when you inject some spending into the economy, it creates this ripple effect, and that leads to a much bigger increase in national income overall.
Okay, so it's not just the initial spending that matters, but the chain reaction it sets off.
Exactly. Imagine the government spends, say, $100 million on a new infrastructure project. That money goes to construction companies who hire workers, buy materials. Then those workers, they spend their wages on groceries, clothes, entertainment, all sorts of things. So that initial injection of money, it multiplies as it moves through the economy.
Like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Each spending decision leads to more economic activity. The marking scheme actually gives a scenario to calculate the multiplier.
It does. It gives you values for things like the marginal propensity to consume, the marginal propensity to import, that kind of stuff. It helps figure out how much of each extra euro earned is spent, saved, or leaks out of the economy through imports.
And what was the multiplier in that example?
It worked out to be 1.43.
Mhm.
So if you inject 100 million into the economy, it could lead to a 143 million increase in national income.
That's a pretty big impact. But the marking scheme also asks about negative multiplier effects.
It does, and it uses a real-world example. When Google scaled back its rental property contracts in Dublin back in 2020,
I remember that. What would the negative multiplier effect look like in a case like that?
well, when a big company downsizes, it can have a ripple effect. Landlords lose rental income, businesses that relied on those Google employees lose customers, and jobs are at risk. So that initial withdrawal of spending, it multiplies as those negative impacts spread.
Like a reverse domino effect. Instead of growth, you get a shrinking of economic activity.
Exactly. It shows how connected everything is. Something that happens in one place, it can have consequences everywhere.
It makes you realize how vulnerable some industries are to those big external shocks like a pandemic.
For sure. Okay, ready for one last topic.
Always.
Let's talk minimum wage.
Ah, the minimum wage. Always a hot button issue. What does the marking scheme say about it?
It shows how much the minimum wage in Ireland went up between 2016 and 2021. It went from 9.15 per hour to 10.1 euro per hour. That's a pretty big jump.
It is. What's the thinking behind those increases?
The marking scheme wants students to think about both the social and economic arguments. On the social side, increasing the minimum wage is about making sure everyone who works earns a living wage. It's about reducing poverty, making sure income is more fairly distributed.
So it's about fairness, basically. Making sure people who work full-time can afford to live.
Exactly. And on the economic side, some argue that higher minimum wages mean people have more money to spend. That can stimulate the economy. Also, it can lead to more productive workers and less employee turnover.
But I imagine there are also concerns about potential negative effects, right?
There are. Some worry that if you raise the minimum wage too much too quickly, it could hurt businesses, especially smaller ones. They might have to cut jobs or hire fewer people. And there's always the risk that businesses will just pass those extra costs on to consumers through higher prices.
So, as with so many things in economics, it's about finding that balance.
It is. And speaking of balancing costs and benefits, the marking scheme talks about cost-benefit analysis. It uses the example of government funding for social housing.
Right, because governments have limited resources. They have to decide carefully where to spend their money.
Exactly. Before they commit to a big project, they have to look at the potential benefits, like providing affordable housing, reducing homelessness. But they also have to look at the costs, like the cost of building and maintaining those homes. Do the benefits outweigh the costs?
It's a reminder that even when you're trying to do good, there are always trade-offs.
There are. Well, that brings us to the end of our journey through the Leaving Certificate Economics marking scheme. It's been quite a ride.
It has. We've covered so much ground, from supply and demand to globalization. And we've seen how those ideas play out in real life, from the price of those AirPods to the challenges of homelessness.
It's been fascinating to see how economics is connected to our lives in so many ways, even if we don't always realize it.
I think everyone listening will come away from this with a better understanding of how these economic forces are shaping our world.
I hope so. Economics can seem daunting, but really it's about understanding how people make decisions when resources are scarce. And that's something we all deal with, whether we're managing our own money, running a business, or making policies that affect entire countries.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the Leaving Certificate Economics exam. I hope you've learned something new and maybe even sparked a new interest in this fascinating world of economics.
And don't forget to check out the show notes for links to more resources if you want to learn more about anything we've talked about today.
Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep exploring the world with an open mind.